Welcome back to Food for the Hungry. Thanks so much for joining us, listening on WMVO Radio, and also seeing us on Time Warner Cable and online today at foodforthehungrycares.org. I'm Marcy Rinehart, and this next hour is going to be a special one that we are going to remember for a while as we take a trip down memory lane to remember the incredible man, Ron Staats. But before we do that, we have to announce a new total from Mount Vernon City Hall. I want to have these gentlemen with me applaud and celebrate $118,993.07 and 18.8 trucks of food. Woo! That number is a good number. Joining me here in the main studio, I have Joe Rinehart, also Ray Richardson, and Dave Bevington. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. And I told you, Dave, now it feels like Food for the Hungry. You sitting beside me.
I'm honored to be here, especially when we're talking about Ron Staats. So.
Ray, you and Ron were friends for many years. You met while you were superintendent at the Knox County Career Center. And thank you for being here. Ray drove all night to get back to Knox County so he could be here. And Ray, tell us just a little bit about your friendship with Ron and kind of how it got started and then grew into a true, not just friendship, but almost like a brotherhood.
Right. And again, driving all night is no cost, no effort to celebrate Ron. And we were friends when I was working, and he was at every board meeting. He was on my advisory committee. And he and I would get together for lunch once a month or so and discuss things and things that was going on at the radio station, things going on at the school. And he would come in and speak to different groups and pour his heart out. And he loved the community. And then after he retired, he called me up one day and he said, well, let's get together. And so we started going to lunch. And Ron had a deep spiritual side. And of course, when we started talking about his faith, our relationship just grew. And we talked on the phone, and then he started saying, well, let's get together twice a month. And so we would get together twice a month, and he would share scripture. It was a very intense, fun, unorganized Bible study. We never talked about the weather. We never talked about sports. He talked about his grandkids, and he talked about his relationship with Christ and the things that he was learning. And he would say to me sometimes, I am just getting so wild and so involved in this. And he said, I have never experienced such peace in my life. And so it was more like a brotherhood, and it was unorganized, but it was always an in-depth scriptural study, and I just love him. He's my brother, and so it's a privilege to be here to celebrate him. So.
Well, one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to share some clips from people in our community. If you were watching a few minutes ago, we had a number of people that chimed in with their thoughts and memories of Ron. So we're going to go ahead and go to these clips. The first one we're going to hear is from Doug Clark. Doug is the president of Knox County Junior Miss Incorporated, which you now know as the Knox County Distinguished Young Women Program. And so here are some reflections from Doug Clark during the Food for the Hungry Drive, reflections of Ron Staats.
What better way to support your community than help the less fortunate right now? You know, times have been tough then as they are now. You know, there's always somebody in need. And, you know, when people knew Ron Staats was involved, they knew it was a good cause. They knew they could believe in it. And I think that was the main thing. I mean, people could just jump behind it then and give it all they could give. And Ron supported it wholeheartedly. And with our program, always, you know, I mean, junior misses, then junior miss, now distinguished young women, you know, we could call on him at a moment's notice and he would help us out with anything, whether it was, you know, for the MC of the show or just we had questions about how to run something. He was always there to help us.
Again, that was Doug Clark from the Knox County Distinguished Young Women Program. And Ron, Marcy, as we well know, was the longtime MC, and we sort of inherited that from Ron.
We did, and I know they continue to give the Ron Staats Community Service Award, and the girls who win that every year are very honored to be able to follow in his footsteps. We are remembering Ron Staats today fondly. You know, when you think of Food for the Hungry, you have to think of Ron, because he sat in so many different studios and so many different scenarios year after year to raise food and funds for this campaign to benefit interchurch social services and the Salvation Army. And when we lost him a few months ago, Joe, I know you and I said, well, we have to do something special. And so we have called on some people who knew him very well. Dave Bevington is here, and it's tough to talk about him. It's still fresh in our hearts and our minds. But when you think about Ron today, what are you thinking about?
Well, so many things. We could spend hours talking about the greatness of Ron Staats, but the one thing that I remember about Ron is his commitment to his profession. And I've said this before, I think young broadcast students, maybe other fields as well, when you commit to do something, do it with everything in your soul that you have. And many times I knew Ron had worked many, many hours, and it was time for him to go home. And Jerry was expecting him home, but the job wasn't done yet. And that's something I learned from Ron Staats. And Ron hired me, and many times he would say, "What was I thinking?" And but he gave me the opportunity in this wonderful world of radio, and to be able to follow in his footsteps. And I think, Marcy, you and Joe have considered him a mentor, and he certainly was that to me. And I learned so much from Ron, not just about the business, but how you treat other people, about faith. And as Ray alluded to, Ron was a deep man of faith. And the last time I saw Ron was about 2 weeks before he passed. And I've told this story before. We were getting out of the car, and he was on his front porch, and he looked like he was asleep. And my wife said, maybe we shouldn't wake him. And I said, well, I don't know. We haven't seen him for a while. And she shut the door, and he looked up, and he said, Bevington, I don't want to see you. I'm trying to take a nap. But then we talked for 3 straight hours and reminisced. And then 2 weeks later, Ron was gone. And what a wonderful, wonderful family that he has. And his son Rod is going in his father's footstep, and his grandkids just loved him, and he loved his grandkids. And the word legacy sometimes is thrown around a lot, but Ron's legacy will live on forever, and I know he will remain a deep friend in my heart forever.
Ray, in your time working with Ron, just as in a professional sense, as the superintendent at the Career Center, what were some of the things that you saw, that you experienced just working with him as he is a reporter, a broadcaster, a news director, and being on your advisory board, that really, those characteristics that made him such a beloved part of our community?
Well, he was very sincere. That was one thing. And the radio used to have a program where they would give 60-second ads to any school, and we'd go throughout the county. And he would tell me, and we would talk. He said, "Hey, this is a good move. So anytime that someone doesn't show up, I'm going to call you." So he would call me in the day before, and he'd say, "Well, it was Centerburg's turn or somebody else, and they won it. So you've got this tomorrow. You've got it all week." And if I would have happened to forget something, like to be on the talk show, and there's 30 minutes, he'd be calling me, and he'd say, "Richardson, get it together. Get it together." That's what he'd always say, was Richardson. But you know, the last 2 years, every time we'd talk, he'd always say, "Brother." And you're my brother, but it was always before. I mean, he was very open, and if he didn't understand something, he would ask it. If he was at a board meeting and there was some kind of controversy or something, he would say, "Hey, what's this all about?" And we were And I felt perfectly comfortable sharing with him because I knew one thing. He was looking for what was best for the community. He was about reporting landings, not crashes. And he would come out to the children's garden and bring his grandkids out there, and then he'd tell me how much that they appreciated the garden. And so we were good friends even then, but he was also a professional, also dedicated, and when he needed to kick butt and take name, if it happened to be with me, he wasn't, I mean, he would just call me up and say, Richardson, let's get this done, you know, that kind of thing. Yeah. But that's the way he was.
Kind of the recurring theme that we're hearing here, he called everybody by their last name. Barb Berry from First Knox National Bank, we talked earlier in the week, and if you saw her tribute a little bit earlier, the same thing. That's how you knew you were on Staats' team. Right. Because he called you, Rinehart, I need you in the studio now. Right. So let's hear another reflection about Ron Staats. We're going to hear from Pat Crow, the director of the Knox County Convention and Visitors Bureau. Pat actually met Ron when his dad had a business in Danville, and Ron came in selling advertising in his early days at WMVO. But Pat is going to, I think, echo some of what Ray and Dave have said about Ron. So let's hear another Ron Staats memory from Pat Crow.
Well, I remember Ron personally in many respects. When you'd meet Ron in the grocery store, when you'd see him out on the golf course, or wherever you would run into Ron, Ron was always your friend. And it was always it was authentic, it wasn't false. It was always, Ron's presentation was always one of authenticity, and I was always so impressed with that. In my life, I like to try to be authentic with people so that there's not a facade or a false nature about what we do, that we're true to our character. Ron was one of the best examples of someone who is true to their character that I could think of. Food for the Hungry is about helping people, and Ron was always concerned about people. At every corner we turn, and I'm going now behind the microphone where you talk to Ron off of the air, Ron was always concerned about what people did to help other people. And Food for the Hungry is one of those programs that helps so many people in our community in so many ways. It would be natural for Ron to have been part of that, and indeed he was.
That's Pat Crow, the director of our Knox County Convention and Visitors Bureau, sharing his thoughts about Ron Staats. This is a tribute to our friend and longtime co-host of this incredible campaign we call Food for the Hungry. And we are sharing some memories with Dave Bevington and Ray Richardson. Joe Rinehart has joined me. And I tell you, when I think about Food for the Hungry, every single year I think about Ron, and I think about being in different locations, doing different things throughout the years, but he was always there, always willing, always ready to take on any challenge and anything I would throw at him. If it meant, you know, putting a costume on and being in the Christmas parade, or you know, whatever it might be, doing an auction and talking about gingerbread houses or pies or whatever, he was always willing and ready to do that because he always cared about this community and wanted to build a stronger community. So Dave, can you share any memories? I mean, as you think back to not just Food for the Hungry, but all those days spent at WMVO Radio, some memories that you can share with us.
Well, many great memories. And Ron and I worked for 30 years together.
Wow.
And I think it's very odd that you can work for someone in a confined building for 30 years. And I can honestly say I thought a lot about this. Over those 30 years, I can remember just one, maybe two times where we actually had a pretty heated disagreement. And Ron always won out because he was my boss. And he, but in 30 years, maybe two times that we actually got to the point where voices were raised. But then later, 10 minutes later, we were fine. But once again, that came from respect. And Ron garnered that respect from anybody that he met, and everybody here knows that. Ron was just such an individual. He loved what he was doing. Obviously, he worked that many years in radio. You don't do that unless you love it. But I remember the very first day I went on the air. It was 1971, he was standing behind me in that AM studio, and my hand was literally shaking to throw that switch, that microphone on. And he said, "Calm down, you're going to fall off the chair. You're shaking so much." And but just a great person. And Jerry, I know, and the family, they have so many great memories. There was a Facebook thing where Ron's family got with Jerry, I think it was last Saturday night, and they decorated the Christmas tree the first time without Ron in 50 years. And so no matter who you talk to about Ron Staats, I've never run into anybody that has said, well, I didn't think he was this. They just words of praise for him. And I've learned so much from Ron about the business, about life, about faith. And, you know, like I said, Marcy and Joe and Ray, you could go hours and talk about the greatness of Ron Staats. And this Food for the Hungry drive was a lot of work, as we all know, and Ron was always ready to pitch in and do what he could to help. And he just,
Absolutely.
I'll never forget the guy. He's just a very, very personal, great friend of mine.
Let's hear another memory, and this is from our mayor, Richard Mavis, mayor of the city of Mount Vernon. And Mayor Mavis and Ron worked together for many years when Dick not only worked as a Knox County Commissioner, but of course had Mavis Sporting Goods here in town. So let's hear from Mayor Richard Mavis as we reflect on the life of Ron Staats.
Well, food for the hungry is critical to our community. I mean, even though we started several years ago when the amount of money and the amount of food that we collected was much smaller than it is today, but it has grown. Ron was part of that growth. He was part of that, you know, let's build this year round. Let's just not say for one day a year we're going to collect some money and collect some food. Ron Staats was committed on a day-to-day basis of making this a better place, and one way we're a better place is because we are very benevolent. People become more benevolent when they're reminded of it pretty frequently. Ron Staats did that. He was a central figure in making Food for the Hungry the great event that it is. And again, there is one day designated as Food for the Hungry Day, but it takes place every day, 365 days is throughout the community of people working forward and working on making that day the great success that it is. Ron Staats was kind of one of the pillars in making Food for the Hungry so successful over the years.
Mount Vernon Mayor Dick Mavis reflecting on his friendship and working over the years with Ron Staats. This is Food for the Hungry 2013 from Mount Vernon City Hall. Joe Rinehart along with my wife Marcy and also our friends Ray Richardson and Dave Bevington as we reflect on Ron Staats. And Ray, Dave shared some stories. How about, do you have a story, you know, whether it's funny, serious, whatever, with Ron?
One thing about Ron, you could be on his program, or we used to have the Superintendent's Roundtable,
right,
which was 2 hours. And we would make up questions and we'd go over them. And he would interact with superintendents on the air live for 2 hours, and it would seem like that you'd been there 15 minutes. And he just had a way of doing that. And you know, you talked about if you were his friend, he always called you by your last name. Well, Jerry always called him Staats.
That's right.
I don't think, very seldom I ever heard him call him Ron, but since they lived out by the school, I would see him walking in the evening, and I would always roll my window down and say, "Jerry, I love you," and I wouldn't say anything to Ron. And but he was just he was a brother, and he was just a compatible person, and with a great sense of humor, but also the ability to be very direct if he needed to be.
Absolutely. We know that, Marcy and Dave and I all know that, working with Staats. And we worked in the trenches together during school closing days. And I remember the ice storm of 2004. Ron and I, again, and Dave, you were there. That was crazy. It was right before Christmas, and people weren't happy because they didn't have electric, and they wanted to have Christmas.
Right.
And that was, I look back on that as a fond memory because we all were in the trenches together. And I remember Jerry and Ron coming in the last day of 1999 because we didn't know what was going to happen. The whole Y2K computer scare. Right. Of course, the whole station ran on computers. And so Jerry brought in food, and so Ron and Jerry and I ended up in the station together while I was on the phone with Marcy, who was at WNZR dealing with the same thing. So we'll never forget New Year's Eve going into the year 2000. Let's hear from another one of our former co-workers who's with us today, Marty Tracy. She's going to share some of her reflections and memories of Ron.
I first met Ron in 1980. He hired me for my very first job in radio at WMBO. I was still a college student, not to how old I am now. And he took me under his wing. He called us greenhorns because we didn't know anything. He taught us so much. And when Ron was getting ready to retire, he asked me to help him do reports from the Knox County Fair. And I was thrilled. I thought, oh, that'd be a lot of fun. And he told me everything, where to go, who to talk to, everything I needed to know about that. And I was thrilled that I was asked to do that because that's something that he had always done. Ron really taught me and so many people a lot about radio and about life. And he let us know that it's important. You know, you work your 40 hours a week, but beyond that, to do things in the community. And Ron was always somewhere, probably every night of the week, he was out helping somebody in the community, appearing somewhere, doing this, doing that. And as far as Food for the Hungry goes, Ron worked at the radio station when it started, when Charlie Kilkenny came up with the idea, and it took off. And Ron realized, as we all have come to now, what an important need it is in our community. We need to help people that are hungry, especially at Christmas time. Ron was one that he knew his celebrity was such that other people would pay attention to what he was saying. You know, he was on the radio, he was a celebrity. So whenever Food for the Hungry time came around, he was ready. He was ready to spread the word and let people know, hey, we need you.
That's Marty Tracy sharing memories and thoughts about Ron Staats, our tribute to our friend, our mentor, and longtime co-host of Food for the Hungry continues. Dave Bevington and Ray Richardson have joined Joe and I for this special time of sharing memories. And Dave, you want to go back to a Little League game? Take us back to what year?
Oh, goodness. It's around 30 years ago. And the radio station sponsored a Little League team over at Lamb Park. Ron was my assistant coach. I was the head coach, and we were in the dugout, and I was going to make some great strategic move in baseball. And he said something to me, well, I don't know if we should do this. I said, hey, you're outside of the building. I'm your boss. He was, all right, Bevington. And another really quick story about the Knox County Fair and Ron, and we remember his wonderful sense of humor, and he would record the fair reports on these small little tape recorders.
I remember.
And I know Joe remembers this, so does Marcy. The microphone was unplugged, and the only thing there was a little outside mic, which would pick up everything. Well, he did his report, and in the background, all you could basically hear was a cow going, like that. You'd barely hear Ron, and he was so unhappy later on, but then he had to laugh about it. But working with Ron, there was never a dull moment.
Never.
But when it was all said and done, Ron was strictly all business about his profession. So.
Our final tribute to Ron on video is going to be from his son, Rod, and his wife, Jerry. Marcy and I had a chance to visit with them last week, and they're actually enjoying a family Christmas this weekend. So let's hear from the Staats family, Rod and Jerry Staats, as they remember Dad and husband.
His best friend was Dave Assfinder, and he was dating my girlfriend, and so we were parked at Beck's, and Dave had this old car called the Willys, and there was no paint on it. It was just primed. And Staats drove in his little white Valiant, brand new Valiant. And I just said, be careful, don't scratch the car. And so then we just started smarting off back and forth, and just started going together. And he would take me to Beck's, and I felt sorry for him, so I'd buy a Coke, and he'd take me home and go back and buy big sandwiches and milkshakes and things. And then he always complained about having to drive 13 miles to Centerburg. And Paul Slaughter got him a job in Coshocton in radio, which he was just dying to get into radio. And so we lived there for about a year. And then he got a job in Wheeling, West Virginia at a rock station. Then we stayed there until Paul Slaughter calls and wanted us to come back to Mount Vernon, to the radio station here. And so we were really happy to come back home. And the rest is history.
When I was growing up, the only way I would be able to spend any time with him was to hang out at the radio station. So I was fascinated with the buttons and volume controls and the records and everything. So he tried to talk me out of it at a very young age. I think I was probably 12 or 13. And he was like, no, don't go into radio. It pays nothing. It's not a good way to be a lawyer or doctor or something. But if you want to make money, then don't do radio. And then I just saw that I was going to be stubborn and bullheaded about it. And it got me started when I was 15. So.
Just loved being involved in the community. I just went through some of his old files, and he had files for absolutely everything that he was involved in. And loved the fair. Just loved. And they teased him about. They put his four-wheeler in manure. And they were always playing tricks on him, the fair board. And he just had the best time out there and loved being there.
He just did everything that I can think of in the community. He was JC's, did the Junior Miss Pageant, he did the Food for the Hungry, he did the Sweet Adelines, the Utica Ice Cream Festival, the parades, and he was Mr. Community. The tractor truck pulls at the Knox County Fair, and I can't think of any time he was never home. He was never home. He was city council meetings, everything. Voting night and election day. He was always somewhere in the community, and he loved it.
Yeah, he loved Christmas. Loved his grandkids.
My brother and my sister and mom and I and all of our kids, we get together every year. We always have a couple of weeks because we all have our own families now. So they decided a few years ago that since nobody really came over on Christmas, we had our own Christmases in our own houses, that we'd all have a family Christmas. So we always get together at the Indian Bear Lodge. It was one of his favorite things, to just relax and watch the family and his grandchildren. And so, yeah, we'll remember him. I've really talked a lot about him since he's been gone to kind of cope. So, just best friend, mentor, who I looked up to, and who I could always count on, and he made me proud to be his son, so I miss him.
I just want to thank everyone that's been so kind. Just donating things, donating to St. Jude's, just providing things for my family, all my good friends and family. I just want to thank everyone. All the recognition for my husband's life. He was pretty unforgettable, and just that's all I have to say is just thank you so much.
Rod and Jerry Staats again for spending some time with us and sharing And again, just that ending tribute from Jerry, what more can you say? She said it very well. Well, before we go, Ray, you have sort of a special moment you'd like to share with us.
Well, Ron and I, like I shared with you, we would get together a couple times a month and we would have a Bible study at a restaurant. And so we'd always do communion. And we used to do communion out in a parking lot. Well, Ron would be talking to everybody before he left the restaurant, so I said, we're just going to do communion in here. And so we started doing communion, and we didn't really care who listened or who. It wasn't about them, it was about our celebration. And we talked about Christ and the significance of communion. And he said, Paul said, there's many sick and weak among you because they do not discern the Lord's body. And so I said, we're going to discern the Lord's body and realize there's healing and blessing and everything that Jesus purchased was in his body. And I said, when we do this, we do it in remembrance of him. And we would take the bread and we would say, in the name of Jesus, we thank you for the body that was broken for us. We discerned it. We wanted Jesus to know that we realized there was power and strength in his body. And then we would take the little cup, and the first time I gave Ron one of these little cups, he didn't really know what to do with it. I thought. And we said, this is the blood that is shed for us. And he said, as often as you do this, you do it in remembrance of me. And we would take the communion together at the restaurant. And we would be grateful, and every time I left there, I left renewed. And that's every time we had a meeting, I left feeling renewed, and I look forward to every meeting with anticipation because I knew there was going to be a sweet spirit there. And sometimes we'd cry, and sometimes we would laugh, but we realized that our relationship with Christ was what it was all about, and the love that he had in his heart, he reflected in his life. And so I'm grateful, so grateful for the friendship and the memories, and of course, more importantly, the hope of us getting together again.
No question.
Amen.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Marcy?
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Ray, and thanks to everyone for sharing these just precious thoughts about Ron Staats. We remember him fondly today. It is time to find out a total, and Ron would say, if he was here, let's get to it, Rinehart. So let's send it to the lobby for a new total. This is the 2013 Food for the Hungry Drive.